All right, so let us begin this afternoon's presentation. I'm Denise Spellberg. I work in the history department as a professor. Some people know me here, and I'm very honored to introduce our guest speaker, Dr. Carel Bertram, Professor Emerita of the Humanities, San Francisco State University. Before I do so, I want to thank Dr. Mark Ravina, current director of the Institute for Historical Studies, who generously sponsored this talk and who is hopefully joining us by Zoom from Boston right now. Lovely. Wave back. And so I would also like to take a moment to acknowledge that the year Carel visited here, it's Dr. Yoav DiCapua's theme. I think he was in charge of the big conference that year, and also the theme that attracted Carel's research back then, which was focused, I think, on trauma and violence. Massive gratitude also to the indispensable and wise Courtney Metter, who makes all things at this institute possible for faculty and visitors alike, and the trusty support of Alyssa here, who is helping out with technical matters. In 2013-2014, Dr. Carel Bertram held a fellowship here at the IHS. She holed up in that very office, the second one to the right, working quite happily and assiduously, despite the fact that there are no windows. And she began to derive meaning from a vast mass of ethnographic data she'd assiduously collected on countless bus tours through Eastern Turkey with Armenian descendants, mostly from the US, people whose children's children had all survived and knew about the 1915 genocide. These encounters with Armenian inheritors of the trauma of mass violence perpetrated and still unacknowledged by Turkey on their ancestors offered these pilgrims to their ancestral lands a chance to rest from memories of loss, varied rituals of reclamation for the dead and the living. Dr. Bertram observed these numerous pilgrims and documented their poignant, varied rituals of coping and remembrance in the wake of trauma. Her long labor, she transformed into an award-winning book, A House in the Homeland, Armenian Pilgrimages to Places of Ancestral Memory. And that painting is by one of the pilgrims, is it not? Yes. It was published by Stanford in 2022. Last year, the Middle East Studies Association awarded Dr. Bertram an honorable mention for the Nikki Keddie Prize, an honor designating distinction in the study of ethnography and religion. She is currently in negotiation with Turkish presses for a Turkish edition of the book. Dr. Bertram's success is a joy to celebrate at the IHS, because I know she considers Austin as one of her homes. And if UT is close to Austin, then that's part of it. The Institute played a central role in supporting her Herculean labors in the construction of a beautiful book that will endure and should be read by many. But don't take my word for it. Here are a couple of brief reviews of her book. Quote, original and engrossing, Carel Bertram's gifts of empathy and storytelling make for a book that is at once heartbreaking and inspiring, essential for anyone interested in place, memory, and mass violence, unquote. And this evaluation, deeply knowledgeable about memory, trauma, pilgrimage, and the sacred, Carel Bertram offers both scholarly expertise and eloquent, moving narrative. A truly wonderful book, unquote. In the trade, we call those rave reviews. And I concur on all counts. Dr. Bertram is a remarkable scholar. I'm also honored to call her my friend. Welcome back, Carel. Welcome back to the fourth floor of Garrison.
Thank you, Denise, for being you, for everyone for being here, to the Institute for hosting me then, making this book possible, and now for allowing me to see all of you and share with you my book. Thank you to the director of the Institute, Mark Ravina, and also to Seth Garfield, there he is, who was the director when I was here, locked in that little room, happily, I must say, locked in that room, working on my material, which was so nice. So for all that support, and support is crucial. Without this kind of support, we all flounder as academics. And thank you to Courtney, who is not here.
She's downstairs.
Thank you, Courtney. Courtney is, there's always somebody who holds it all together. And then and now, and to Alyssa, who got our screen working. And I'd like to thank Jim Burr for being here, because he is the editor at UT Press, but he was the editor of my first book, which I will introduce to you. But my ongoing thank you goes to Denise, who became my mentor when I was here and really was there for me through thick and through thin, through Zoom and through email, through the pandemic, centering my thought, giving me good ideas, intellectual support and depth, interventions, and so much so that if you don't believe that I am really indebted to her, I dedicated my book to her.
Oh.
So, and my mom, but that she didn't help. That was different. So some of the things, let's see if it's good. Oh, it doesn't go forward. This way, that's okay. I did it here. It didn't go forward here. Thank you. It's always a workaround. So because I've been here and because many of you fortunately are my friends, or maybe will be my friends, you may be familiar with the work that I have been doing and that Denise introduced. I traveled with Armenians from the diaspora who bravely went to Anatolia, the site of the Armenian Genocide of 1915, to search for what might be left. I went with them. I watched them as they were digging through erasures in places where there was a legacy of trauma, but also places that were associated with the richness of home. So with that said, you might think that this book is going to be about the genocide, but it's not. It's about its aftermath in another generation. So the people that I am going to introduce to you today and talk about that are also in my book are part of this aftermath. And in fact, they represent the continuing story of the genocide. And they were traveling to what they felt was the scariest place on earth because of what they knew. Their deepest dream was to find the houses of their parents or grandparents that those parents and grandparents, survivors, had lost during the genocide. And here they are on a bus carrying family photos and looking at maps as their small groups trying to find this lost history. So in today's talk, I'll concentrate on how in today's Turkey, a government that denies the genocide and a land that had been emptied of Armenians, these pilgrims engaged in what I found to be a spiritual repossession of their home places by physically placing themselves in its story. In fact, it may be said that every traveler was in search of some sort of spiritual reward. And it's for that reason that they call themselves pilgrims, and I do too. As you'll see, what gives a deep and poignant authenticity to their personal, even visceral acts of reconnection is how they merge their new experience of their old homeland with their family in the host land, the places they are traveling from. In most cases, for me, the United States and Canada, but also from all over the world. Their connection was to those people whom they knew in their host lands. So when I talk about their ancestors whose past they are connecting to, they're really, I found, only peripherally and secondarily connecting to the vast history of Armenians that go back for centuries. They're really connecting with their own families, with their own parents and grandparents, whose hometown-based Armenian culture they personally inherited. So today we have a living example, Mihran, of one of the pilgrims, and I have his picture up there. He reached his grandfather's land, the plot of land where the house had been in the village of Kusinik, and he carried with him a photograph of his father, who had traveled there before him, over a decade before him, as a pilgrim. His father had told him Kusinik stories of his own father, stories that were listened to and learned in Massachusetts. And so the emotional power of both his and his father's Kusinik experience is tied to Massachusetts, where they heard these stories. So Mihran's memories of Kusinik took place in Boston. There, you can correct me later, don't do it in front of everybody. So Armenians like Mihran and his father Van, who searched for the home places of their survivor families, are their own unique generation, almost gone. I call them descendant pilgrims, as opposed to the survivors themselves, some few of whom also returned to their villages. I refer to the actual survivors who returned as native pilgrims. And both are addressed in my book, although I'm not going to talk about the native pilgrims today, but I do talk about them in the book. These groups have very different histories, attachments, and responses, but in both cases, they could not return or go to visit their home villages until the 1950s, when Anatolia was opened up to visitors. So we have some of the original survivors going back, looking to see if anybody is left in the 50s, because the travel restrictions to the interior were lifted. But travel into a hostile landscape, or what is felt as a hostile landscape, even today, is difficult. The places that they were looking for were at the end of dirt roads. Landmarks that they had heard about were no longer there. The churches and the monasteries were missing. The original village names had often been changed, and so we're not on the map. If you're hunting for it, you can't find it. The gift from heaven was Armin Aroyan from Glendale, California, or Monrovia, California, if you know the area. He had traveled in the late 80s to Turkey as an engineer, and decided he would go to find his father and grandfather's town in Jibin, which is near Urfa. And when he came back and he told the Armenians, this is a possibility, you know, people wanted to go with him. And so he slowly, by word of mouth, started taking people, and that just grew and grew. So, oh, it's not connecting unless I do it. All right. So I joined him in 2007, and I was really lucky that he welcomed me, and that the pilgrims slowly welcomed me, because I was a Turkish scholar, which was not something that they particularly wanted on their trips, but very soon people were amazingly gracious to me. So over the course of about 9 years, between 2007 and 2015, I sat with travelers on their buses. I listened to the stories that they had brought, or actually the stories that had brought them there. But most of all, I just watched to see what happened when they finally found the place that they called home. And I found that amazing. It's a little bit about my background and how I see the world, at least from a scholarly point of view. I am an art, architecture, and urban historian of the Middle East. In other words, I'm interested in the history of the visual world. And sometime in my graduate studies at UCLA, I fell in love with Ottoman houses. They resonated with me, and I decided I was going to follow them all over. But as I started to study, I had a Fulbright. I went to Turkey. I was studying these houses, figuring out what it was I wanted. And I started to realize that the secrets that I wanted these houses to divulge was not why they look so much alike, but why and how those houses had become such a memory object in the minds of the citizens of the new Republic of Turkey. And that project became my first book, published with Jim Burr at UP Press. This book's story, and as you'll see, they overlap in time and place. This story begins at the end of the 19th century when the Ottoman Empire was closing, and continues into the early 20th century, the period of the emergent Turkish Republic. And I show how this old house was called upon to do the cultural work of defining the soul of the new republic self. So I then turned into a historian of memory. And because when you think about it, and I think about this a lot, memory always takes place, I became a historian of how memory and place get stuck together. But by 1900, these Ottoman Turkish houses had not only stopped being built, but they had begun to be subdivided and no longer with the pride of multi-generational families. And then they became run down, and pretty soon they were torn down. The people who so lovingly remembered them, often as the houses of their childhoods, had chosen to leave them. In fact, their fond look backwards was from their new, comfortably modern Turkish apartments with balconies, picture windows, and plumbing. So I guess I would have moved too, much as I love those houses. The Turkish house book, with its focus on the Republic's memory, a post-1923 Republic, now without its once large Armenian population, had not considered that many of the Ottomans who had lived in these houses were Armenian, and they had lost them too. But they hadn't lost these houses to modernity. When the Armenians lost their houses, they also lost their homeland, and many of them, maybe most of them, lost their lives as well. So I had unwittingly continued their history of being written out of Turkish history. There are other important differences between my two books, and maybe the most important is methodological. In the Turkish house book, I accessed the people who did the remembering or who were creating historical memory through representational sources, through what they had said, what they had written, what they had painted, what they sang about. The Turkish houses on the cover of this book are from a series of house paintings by the Ottoman painter Hoca, which is teacher, Hoca Ali Rıza Bey, who lovingly preserved many Ottoman houses on canvas and conveyed his love for them and fear for their loss to a whole generation of his students and followers. Some of the Armenians in this new book, A House in the Homeland, are also accessed through secondary sources, especially the native pilgrims like Hampartsum Vasilyan, the author of this article from 1953. He would have been about 100 when I started in 2007. So obviously, working with native pilgrims meant that I was using secondary sources, often travel memoirs. I used secondary sources for some of the descendant pilgrims too, but those were interpreted through my understanding of what these pilgrimages were like when I was traveling with the actual travelers. I also had personal contacts with many of the people I didn't travel with such as Mihran. Another example is from Makaryan. I read his travel memory book of poems, and then I communicated with him through email, and over time met him on Zoom. He enlarged his story, and then he sent me this photo of himself in his father's village of Shushans. So for the people I traveled with, and for many of those I did not, the main part of my book, depends on what I've come to call a longue durée ethnography, where I kept in touch for long periods and learned more about what was behind people's stories. And I made many friends. So I feel like this was a blessing that was handed to me. Between 2007 and 2015, I traveled with at least 100 pilgrims in those small little caravans with Armin Aroyan, mostly with Armin. I did some on my own after a while. But my database includes 400 pilgrims. This is the Homeland map that you would find in my book. So here it is that I drew to show where we had been, and also a kind of cognitive map that this is a map full of houses. It is the part of Turkey that is considered historically Armenian and is also considered by Armenians historical Armenia. So in both cases, it has been thought of and continues to be thought of as Armenian, even though now it is part of Turkey. The places I've circled here for today are the places that I've just mentioned. So Hrants, Shushans, Mihrans, Husinig, and Armin Aroyan's Jivan. This map is also of historical Armenia, and it makes clear why it has that name, as its colors in Eastern Turkey, the ones that are the Armenian population under the Ottomans and before the genocide. And you can see that it was thick with Armenians, especially in the red and the orange areas. But in the end, the map of historical Armenia is also a genocide map. This map shows where Armenians were gathered to be sent on deportation marches. And so these are the places where the survivors came from, those who told their stories to the next generation, the descendant generation that owned them as their memory stories. I'd like to emphasize the important difference, because it's important to me, between regular memory and what I have come to call memory stories, which I see as the defining attribute of the descendant pilgrims. Although in the academic world it may be a little old-fashioned, I consider the use of the term memory as something autobiographical. Whether or not it's accurately remembered, a memory is something considered to have been acquired firsthand by me. That's what I think of as memory. Natives or survivors, for example, have personal memories of their villages or of the genocide. But when these survivors relate their memories to their descendants, they become what I call memory stories. The stories of their listeners, the hearers who did not live them, but were deeply affected by the hearing of learning them from their family. An example, there's many different examples in the book. Alice is a descendant pilgrim. She was born in Beirut, but lived there with her grandmother, who was a survivor. She had escaped from the town of Hassan Beyli. Her memory story she put into verse, a poem that she wrote in Armenian and that I had translated for me. Luckily, when I was here, there was a graduate student, Armenian graduate student, who just said, I'm here, I will help you. And we sat, there was also a Turkish student who did the same thing, sat for hours and hours and did translation. So this was translated by Lisa Gulasarian, who is now teaching at Harvard. Alitz had brought her memory story to Hassan Bailey when she and her cousins made the pilgrimage there. And here in her poetry, which I'll show you, she felt like the house that she was searching for was like a sacred light that emanated from her grandmother's stories. The first time I heard my grandmother say Hassan Bailey's name, my grandmother's glad tidings from Hassan Bailey was every Christmas Eve, the three magi, those wise beings, Melkon, Caspar, and Bagdasar, from far away, they found a way to have the good news of Christ's birth come to our door. I'm sitting next to my grandmother. My eyes are on her sewing basket and colorful wools. I am 8 years old. In fact, Alice makes clear that what she is searching for was the house that was from my childhood inscribed on my soul. And for those of you who are really good at looking at photos, you'll realize she has two different hairdos. And you may not notice, but actually she went on two different trips. So I have her photos and poetry from two different trips. So with this identification or insight that houses could be inscribed on one's soul through a story, my work takes an important turn from the much used concept of inherited memory, a concept that entered the field of memory studies through Mariana Hirsch, who suggested that descendants come to feel the survivor family's traumatic experiences as if they were their own experiences and thus as their own memories. So, as I hope you will remember, I use the word memory as something autobiographical. And before writing this talk that I'm giving you today, I went back and looked at the talk that I gave when I first came, my first week. I think I was one of the first speakers when I was here. And I reviewed that paper, which I called Putting Historical Memory in Its Place. And I saw that I had used the idea of inherited memory too. But it seems that somewhere along the way, something hit me as I was transcribing or reading everybody's stories and their personal histories. I came to understand what the pilgrims were carrying were memory stories that were embedded in their own experience of hearing the autobiographical stories of their close family members. So I can see why the idea of inherited memory is seductive, but because it exists at an empathic psychological level rather than at the level of experiences, I had no way to grapple with its contours or to trace its history. But memory stories have histories in the real world, and so they too take place. But Ali's memory never took place in Hassan Bailey. Memory stories don't take place in the places their stories are about, that is, the villages and towns of Anatolia. Rather, they take place in the diaspora, in the host countries, where they're part of the hearer's lived experiences. And so these stories have their autobiographical histories too. Here, Marianne Arslanian Kazanjian, who would later be a pilgrim, sits with her children as she listens to her beloved great uncle Vahan's stories of his memories of Yozgat while they're sitting at his house in Philadelphia. Marianne also shows how memory stories can be embedded in material objects, for she had brought a thick folder, which she let me copy, of items resonant with memory stories that were tied to the house she was searching for, including a photo of her father as a child taken in Yozgat with his grandparents, and also a hand-drawn family tree by her uncle, also rooted in Yozgat. And as Denise mentioned, one prized possession that she brought was a painting of the town of Yozgat, done from memory by her uncle after reaching Philadelphia in 1911. She brought a copy because she thought it was going to be a kind of map to find her house. I'm so glad she brought it because she graciously let me use it as the cover of my book. But it turned out not to be at all useful as a map to find her house. She had been told stories of a wealthy family who owned a mansion in Yozgat, and she thought that the big building was it. But it turned out to be a government building. But Armin, bless him, did find her house, and it was a mansion. But it had become a Yozgat ethnographic museum, Ottoman ethnographic museum. And she would never have found it because its identity, its Armenian identity, was like a guarded state secret. Although I know from later that it stood in a neighborhood that was once all Armenian, there was nothing in the signage or in the brochures that said that it had been Armenian. But Armin found that some of the old timers knew it as the Arslanian house, Marianne's family name. So memory stories and the importance of their being autobiographical is a through line of my book. But I want to introduce you to some of the other things I identified by being there and by watching. The first is that the ancestral house and the hometown is a deeply sacred and spiritually effervescent space, but it is also the space of the profane. Carel Bertram, who found his father's house, also in the village of Husinik, shows us how the house, or the place where it once stood, if it's gone, is invested with a sacred character. But he also shows us how the sacred and the profane always appear together. Using a map made by a survivor, one that Mihran had also used, Carel was able to stand in what was once the garden of his father's house, now owned by a Turkish citizen, a non-Armenian stranger. He contemplated it as if it were the Garden of Eden. He touched almost every plant, and he remembered that his father had told him that no flowers or fruits in California could match the beauty, the size, or the taste of those that were grown there in Husinik. And so Carel made sure that he was gather some of that dirt so he could put it on his flowers at home, because maybe the magic would transfer. And here you can see that this is a cropping from a video. So I have all of his, what he said, quotes of what he said. He brought with him a Husinik photo of his father standing with his family and held it in his father's garden with a sense of house pride. For in it, his then young father was holding a book. A book, he said, and remembered stories told of an education-loving family in the before time, the time before their lives were shattered. And so Carel giddily called out to no one or to the spirits of place, "I'm back, I'm here." But as he walked, he talked to himself. And after looking around, he stopped, he sighed, and then he mused, I wonder if they put his head with his body. I'm swallowing, but time for a deep breath. Carel's father had told him how, in the systematic violence of the genocide, He had watched his father being decapitated and how he saw his own father's head roll along the ground. Every home or hometown that we visited held profane stories. Here I use profane, not like quotidian and not like non-sacred, but like profanity, in the way that the philosopher Maurice Halbwachs understood it. To Halbwachs, profane space is the place inhabited by enemies of God, which may even be cursed, and where eyes and ears must be closed, because it is the place where body and soul have been defiled. And yet, because of their beloved families and the values they had nurtured, pilgrims felt that they were standing on sacred ground. Carel had even told his wife that if anything happened to him on this trip, be sure to have them bury me here. As a historical, but also as a spiritual landscape, Carel understood his ancestral house as an appropriate place for his own spirit to rest for eternity. My second example, which I really love, of spirituality and the spirit-laden configuration of home, comes from the pilgrimage of the Armenian folk singer Hasmik Harutyunyan, who traveled from Yerevan to her ancestral village of Mush. My grandparents were from Mush, she said. I grew up with them. My whole life is about Mush, and at home in Yerevan, we ate traditional food, observed traditional days. Everything we celebrated was in the same way that they had done it in Mush. My grandmother and grandfather, they lost their whole family, but somehow they survived. My grandmother lost her first husband and a child, but I grew up with their culture of singing and dancing. When she arrived in Mush, Hasmik sang Kelilao, a song of longing that expresses the feeling that there is a flight of ancestral souls always headed homeward, that is, from their own, toward their own village. And the souls are calling their children to join them there. Come, let us go, my son, let us go to the fields where there are healing herbs. Without us, the stones shed tears. Our mothers and fathers are there. Their sweet voices are calling. Hasmik then recalled that while my grandmother was dying, she said to my father, when I die, please take me to Mush. This meant crossing an uncrossable border between Armenia and Turkey. And so her father said, I can't do that. There's a border. I can't do that. But his mother's response was, what's a border for a dead person? A dead person's spirit can fly. And so there is no border for a dead person. Every pilgrim was caught in this double reverberation of the sacred and the profane, of joy and pain, and had to make a choice of how to accommodate them. And often I found this was through rituals that they invented. And so we come to a second of my insights and through lines, and that is the sacredness of the space of home elicits personally meaningful performances, even the invention of rituals that offer pilgrims a restorative agency. Here I turn to Oski as an example of those who, on finding their ancestral village, performed rituals to answer the needs of their spiritual quest. Here in her mother's village of Govdun, she performed a ritual of collecting local soil as a relic to take home with her. A little background is that 5 years before the genocide, Oski's father had left her mother and their only child to find work in Providence, Rhode Island, with the hope of either having money to return or having the money to bring his family. but like thousands of others in 1915, he lost contact with them. Oski's mother and the child had been set on the death marches to the deserts of Syria. Their small daughter died along the way, but Oski's mother survived, and within several years, she was able to make contact with her husband and be brought to the United States. And there they had 3 more children. Oski was one of them. Although she found no trace of her actual house, Oski considered the village as her home place. In fact, she even found that the Armenians were still part of village memory. And some older Armenians knew stories of her mother's famous uncle. He was called Sebastasi Murad of Sivas, who was a famous Armenian freedom fighter, but he had also taken care of local Turks in the village, and so he was much beloved. Oski's brother Murad was named for him. So 3/4 of a century after her mother had been exiled from Govdun and landed in Rhode Island, Oski stooped down to dig some of the earth. But what I found astonishing was that almost as soon as her scoop entered the soil, Oski stood up and began to talk to her mother. "Okay, Ma, you got your dream," she said. "Ma, I'm here. I'm here on your land. And I know you never really ever thought I'd come here." I can't do the Rhode Island accent. "But here I am. And I'm beginning to become proud, Ma. I wish you could have come back to see it." It seems that in the act of digging the earth, Oski had activated its spirits, allowing her to speak to her mother, who had passed away long before, but not here, but in Rhode Island. For Oski, this ritual action changed the meaning and memory of place, for it made her permanently and autobiographically a part of Govdun's history. It's here in Govdun that she spoke with her mother, and this was done physically, not virtually. And so this act placed her in Govdun's history and in Govdun's story in a new and profound way. She had become an agent in her own healing. Another ritual that I will mention is what I call communion. And of course, I have named these. These are just actions that I gather and typologize and say, oh yes, these are relics. This is communion. And communion, just like relics, takes many forms. At its simplest, communion is when pilgrims on their home turf perform something seemingly in tandem with their ancestors, a ritual that merges their bodies and souls. So here I'll give you the example of Hago, goes by Bob, his experience, and hope that you will see the difference between Bob's communion and Oski's communicating. But first, I want to point out, and hard to explain, that you'll see 2 towns on the map, Sivas and Yozgat. So heads up on that and just follow me. It's complicated. No test. Yozgat is Bob's own mother's town, and I have an entire chapter entirely on Bob, who came with his cousin Steve and performed a different ritual there, that of leaving ex-votos in a Yozgat house. However, when he was in Sivas, something happened that tied him to Yozgat and to Philadelphia. So follow me on this, for it's in the town of Yozgat where Bob performed a communion with his mother, who every year in Philadelphia had taken the wool out of the family quilt, the yorgan, and cleaned it in a way that she had learned to do as a young girl when she was in Yozgat. This involved washing the wool and then beating it dry, which also aerated it. and they use a special tool called a halach. So this is what happened. The pilgrims minibus stopped in Sivas so that Aroyan, who was lost, could ask for directions. The bus parked right in front of a woman who was out on the sidewalk, fluffing the wool that she had taken out of her yorgan, or quilt, for its yearly cleaning. She was fluffing it with her halach, her fluffing stick. What I saw was that everyone on this little bus excitedly got up and crowded out through the door to watch her. The only person left on the bus was me, a little bit puzzled. But then I heard Sylvia saying to everybody, or nobody in particular, your grandmother did it just like this. Yeah, I went out too. Ruth, Bob's wife, who actually was from Sivas, which is why we were there, shyly asked if she could buy a piece of the wall, as if it carried like a relic, spiritual power from her own past. And of course, the woman happily gave her some. But Bob, who had learned this art from his Yozgatsi mother and her sisters, used creative gestures to ask the woman if he could just take over the job. Now, I couldn't find, I'm sure I took a picture, but I couldn't find a picture of him doing that. So I have a little collage to let you see what it might have been like when, for the next it seemed forever, maybe 5 minutes, he started pounding the wool, astounding the woman who watched him, and also stopping all the passersby who could not understand why an American tourist was beating this wool in Sivas. Bob later described to me that he felt he had entered a kind of altered state, a realm of consciousness in which he was beating that wool along with his mother, as she had done it with her mother and sisters in Philadelphia. Well, at the same time, he's remembering that, he's remembering his mother, remembering Yozgat. Now, through this ritual, they could do this again together at their ancestral home. So communion is a moment outside of time, but in the space of a merged world. The meaning of Homeland radiates out from the house place, but its meaning and the experience of it is mediated by the pilgrims' connection to their current diasporic land, as I have said. So in this next section, I tease out for you what has already been mentioned, that pilgrims experience their home villages as a place that is in construct with their homes and their families in the diaspora, which of course we then can connect through memory stories. In fact, I suggest that these pilgrimages are even imagined as taking place on a map of hometowns in the diaspora that are overlaid on a map of Anatolia. Perhaps the one experience that I might claim to be specifically an Armenian experience. This felt double mapping became quite visual to me when Armin Aroyan spoke on the bus to pilgrims as a way of just passing time on these long trips between villages. So Armin would use his mic and he'd turn to the people in the back of the bus and he'd say, so, who do you know who lives in Troy and Albany in New York? And people would come up with the names and he would sum them all up as Antepsis. They're all from Gaziantep. Where do the Tadenses live? Waukegan. Tomarzatses, Racine. Pozmashenses, Detroit. In the United States, the first generation of Pozmashenses in Detroit were such a tightly knit group, living together in the same neighborhood. Then when they neared home on the city bus, the bus driver would call out, Pozmashen. And I thought, you know, these second and third generation pilgrims might have felt something comfortingly similar if, when they arrived at Pazmashen, Armin had called out, next stop, Detroit. And so the double mapping homeland that they were experiencing began to emerge for me on these bus trips. And of course, I'm writing all these things down. But the Detroit Pazmashenses who got off of Armin's bus in the real Pazmashen found it deeply disturbing. The Armenian area had been erased, a strategic move to suggest that no one, let alone Armenians, had ever lived there. But at the level of the soul, the pilgrim Marduk was prepared. He had asked the driver, Jamal, to stop the bus so that he could gather a rock along the road near Van in order to take it to the village of Pazmashen, over 200 miles to the west. As a Pazmashense himself, he had read that all Pazmashenses traced their roots to Van. But at one time in the ancestral past, the entire village had moved from Van to Pazmashen as a group. What am I going to do with it? He said, I'm going to take it to Pazmashen like the rest. In carrying his stone, he was carrying the spirit of one of his own that belonged to Pazmashen, where everyone should be together. He was working for the soul against history. With these examples, I've introduced you to several of the through lines of my thoughts and my work on an ethnography that investigates how memory and place confront each other for a people whose homeland had been brutally taken away. So as I said, no quiz, but instead I'll give you a short summary. And the first thing I want you to remember, or maybe all of it, is memory. Although pilgrims talked about their pilgrimages as returns, they had never been to these villages before. Their knowledge of these places came from hearing stories about them, which became their memory stories. The emotional weight and the emotional freight of these stories came from the pilgrims' attachment to their beloved storytelling survivor families. These attachments and memory stories, the stories that led them on these pilgrimages, made them experience home villages as a sacred landscape, which provided the space for and the rewards of the rituals they performed there. A major and unexpected reward was through these rituals to have experiences with their own family in the places of their family memories, giving the pilgrims their own autobiographical place-related memories. The reward then was a partial repair of the hole in their history, if only at the level of the soul. It is also because being in Rosgat was also being in Philadelphia that this merged geographical sensibility was restorative, as it connected what was lost with what had survived and what was already in the diaspora deeply theirs. At the individual level, their performative actions, gathering soil as relics, communion, but also other rituals such as invocations, the placing of votives and ex votos, the making of shrines, the asking for blessings, meant that they took individual agency in making a place for themselves in the story of their homeland. At the communal level, they remapped homeland as a palimpsest with their postland, giving their homeland yet another sense of familiar and familial ownership. With an understanding that there is no closure to genocide, especially to denied genocide, these seekers still found ways to tap into the sacred over the profane, to what could sustain them rather than to what might destroy them, and to make their lost land a visceral, spiritual, and enduring connection to their own place in history. Thank you so much for listening. Didn't bring books. This is Denise's. I didn't want
Yours
to
now.
carry everything, but I do have a lot of, cards if you want to remember it of the book, and also for Jim, the other book if you'd like to remember it. And from what I understand, there's time for questions.
Yes.
And Denise, do you want to come up here, or do you want to be there?
No, why don't, I will, ask people just to raise their hands here, and if we have people on Zoom who have questions, Alyssa will,
Yes.
someone will tell me.
I will.
Okay, oh, we can see what's there. Questions you would like to ask Dr. Bertram? Anyone here?
Anna,
I just think I had never realized you were going to talk so much about memory and spirituality, and that just opens things up when you connect it with Turkey and Armenia. I thought it was a wonderful way to approach it and made everybody else think of their own lands and places, and so many of us that's important. So I really look forward to reading the book.
thank you. And you're right. I mean, it's at a very personal level with the Armenians, but people who have lost their homelands or remember past spaces can understand.
Is there an Armenian homeland? Is there an Armenian, what am I trying to say? Is there a place that Armenians identify with besides Turkish Armenia? Is there forgive my ignorance, but I'm just wondering if there is a,
Yes,
yeah, okay,
perfect question.
yeah,
Absolutely perfect question, because there is this historical Armenia, which
Yeah.
was once envisioned, I mean, it was before nationalism and specific borders, but once envisioned as a larger Armenia. What is left is the eastern part of this historical Armenia, which has a history of developing into the Republic of Armenia. I'm looking at Miran, who can give the best talk.
Anush is she's from there.
Even though I wasn't born in Armenia, but I lived there all my mature life. So since 16, I was there.
And where was your family from before they lived in Armenia? Were they centuries back in Armenia, or had they come from Ottoman?
They had come from Ottoman, I suppose, but my grandparents came from Nagorno, and they moved from Nagorno to Uzbekistan, and this is where my mother was born, and then we were born and we lived there. And from Uzbekistan, we moved back to Armenia because of my father's decision that we should go back to Armenia and conduct live our homeland. Yeah.
Thank you. So obviously, Armenia that exists today as a republic, an independent republic, is a homeland and a welcoming space and a future, not only for Ottoman Armenians, but for now refugees from Artsakh, Nagorno-Karabakh, who are going there. However, what you'll see in my book is that although many of the people, it's not true for everyone, but many of the pilgrims who went to find their home houses and brought the music and the stories and the foods and everything from Ottoman Armenia, love the Republic of Armenia and feel that is a safe haven for them, but they don't feel that they have the stories that connect them to it. So they have a lost homeland that they don't want to give up, and especially because the languages between East Armenia and Western Armenia are slightly different, and all of you know that.
Yeah.
You want to hear the same melodies, you want the same spices in your eggplant as you had before. So yeah, a very important question. Thank you.
There's a little mountain that separates the eastern and western Armenia, which
a sacred mountain.
Has a biblical significance, right?
Noah's Ark landed on this mountain.
Oh,
I think. Yeah, and it's very sacred to Armenians, but it is in Turkey, on the
Right.
edge of Turkey, so it's a.
but we consider it ours.
I was growing up, I remember in the 1940s, there was a chap who would visit our family in San Antonio. He was called Minnie. And I remember I knew he was different from us because he was somewhat darker looking somehow, dark hair. And sort of, I remember my mother and my cousins, female cousins, sort of swooning over him because he was obviously a handsome dude. And I remember asking my father one time, I said, "Who is Minnie?" And he said, "Oh, he's an Armenian, pay no attention." And I said, "What's an Armenian?" And my father said, "I don't know, you know." But
Interesting.
he was, he really had an interesting effect on that little family of mine in San Antonio because he was always on the kind of the outer edge, but never completely in because I don't think the men folk trusted him very much, but the ladies certainly
Too
liked him.
gorgeous.
Anyway, that's the story. That memory sticks with me.
Seth has a question.
Yeah, thanks for that excellent talk, by the way. Can you talk about how the Turkish authorities and the local Turkish
Ask the question and then you're talking.
pilgrims,
Okay, thank you.
pilgrims' relationship with the current communities that are living in those areas, what that interaction is like.
Really, that's also very important and mixed because Turkey is a big country and the pilgrimages started in the 1990s and have continued till 2015. They pretty much ended then. And Turkey has gone through various levels of interaction with the Kurdish population, which is somehow felt to be a message of how they feel about Armenians as well. At the very beginning, in the 90s, Western Armenia, historical Armenia, was a dangerous place because of Kurdish desire for independence. And so there was a lot of repression and it was difficult to go. And when the pilgrims went, they were advised by Armen, don't say anything in Armenian. They would be stopped and people would get on the bus, but they really were interested in Kurds, although because the Armenians aren't there anymore, they aren't looking for Armenians, but they figure they're as bad as Kurds. However, over time, with the Kurdish, what we call the Kurdish opening, when the Kurds started to have a dialogue that has ended with the Turkish government, it became easier. The Kurdish population recognized the genocide in 1982. And so there has been a kind of not a partnership, but a sense of brotherhood between those two groups. And they have made clear that they understand that there was a genocide. I found people in villages always knew about the genocide. They might not want to talk about it, but they knew. And they might want to talk about it. They might have been horrified, but they knew who had done the killing and where the killing fields are. The people in the West, these are broad generalizations, but I'll publish them anyway. The people in the West or in the big cities, their stories were the trope of how the Armenians had tried to undermine the development of the Turkish Republic. And so they have a very specific argument that they have learned in school, and they will say that one.
Carol, there are two online questions. The first from Tracy Matisic.
So from Dr. Tracy Matzik, she says, "Thank you, Carol. I'm wondering if there is any room for thinking about, quote, post-directional memory in this context. Michael Rothberg's notion of the ways that memories of one historical trauma get woven into complicated contemporary histories, be that in this case, perhaps persecution of Kurds in Turkey, or the many types of racism, trauma, conflicted histories in the US or Canada, i.e. do the pilgrims' memories draw on, add to, or occlude historical trauma in their milieu?"
But can I just say, I think Carol just answered my question to a large extent. So I tried to withdraw it, but we didn't succeed. If you want to say more, Carol, that would be great. But I think you did just speak to it a bit.
Great question, and really worth a panel at Mesa. Because it enlarges so much on what people do with their memories and how different groups interact, and it would be especially useful in Turkey because it's not just the Armenians and the Kurds, there's the Alevi and the Laz and millions of, not millions, but 50 different groups and languages that have these kinds of memories that then they become aligned with. So, but I didn't run across it in my work. So everything that I talk about is what I actually saw. Thank you. I'll think about that.
And then
Dr. Lichtenstein, Tatiana?
Hi. Thanks so much for your talk. And I couldn't hear Seth's question. I think mine might be along the same lines, but one of the things I'm really struck by was just the similarities between the kind of pilgrimage of ethnic Germans and of Jews to Eastern Europe. These are, of course, a genocide and mass displacement of a much like earlier, or sort of later, I should say, like a generation or more later, right? And so when that began in the 1990s, there was a lot of uncertainty in communities about property and about people wanting to reclaim property, and that so one of the similarities I heard was this, locals knew even when they had not, their families hadn't lived in that area during the war, locals knew who had done what and who lived in what house and who had what. And so there was a lot of uncertainty in the 90s about property, and that resulted in some hostility that, again, the government was also responding to in various ways, I think in Poland in particular, but even in Czechoslovakia then before it broke up, they kind of reasserted the 1945 decrees around property. So I'm wondering if any of that had come up as well, like how I know this is earlier, right? So is there less tension around this? Is that sort of a closed chapter, or is there still this kind of tension when the pilgrims come and meet locals?
Lots of tension. There's lots of tension, especially when people have their deeds or insurance claims and can locate with maps the exact places. And very often the people in those houses are not the people who were there at the genocide. I mean, not even their families. What happened would be an entire village was destroyed. And then a new group of people came in from the Balkans or Romania, they were situated there and knew the history, but they weren't the people who were part of the genocide. However, they knew that it was somebody else's house, but very few of them were worried that anyone was going to try and take it. The property laws right after the genocide were such that if it's very clever, Armenians who had been sent on the death marches, of course, some died, but those who wanted to come back rarely were allowed in, and everything was closed. So they weren't allowed in. But if you owned property and you left on these death marches and were gone for more than 2 weeks, you had given up your right to the property. So that was in the law. So it was pretty clever. I think there are some people that I met in various Armenians look at me, I'm an Armenian now. Armenians who were looking at houses and saying, that was mine, and thinking, gee, maybe they could get it back. Maybe in Husinik, there was someone who wanted to buy land there, his family land, and maybe give it to the Armenian community. But most people didn't have that desire. I mean, they wanted the recognition and they wanted some kind of communal reparations because so much money and so much land and so much of the wealth of Turkey after World War I was based on Armenian money, and that's quite traceable. Does that sort of answer you?
Yeah, I'm also thinking that a lot of it was in the minds of the locals, right? That they are worried, the people who made these pilgrimages didn't necessarily want the property, but just them showing up induced all these fears about the property issue and so on. Yeah, so it complicated, I think, the visits. Thank you.
In my experience, I found that the people who were worried, and there were at various times, the children would say, "Oh, I know where the cemetery is. Let me take you." And the father would say, "No, no, no, you don't." You push them away. But their fear, I think, was about the government and about recognizing what had happened. They were not afraid of somebody coming in and taking their house. And in fact, people were very welcoming, and brought people into their houses and talked to them and offered them yogurt drinks and made friends and talked about their various histories. In fact, in recent times, when we now do DNA tests, which are illegal in Turkey, but there are pilgrims who have come carrying the DNA test with them, and one of them found grandfather's house where it was. It had been torn down, but the family was still there, the grandchildren, and they said, "Oh, yes, grandma was one of those grandmothers, one of those women who had been left behind. So grandma was Armenian." So this woman, this pilgrim, said, "Mehmet, would you be willing to take a DNA test?" And Mehmet said, "Yes, I would." So she had him do it, took it home. Turned out they were cousins. So that after a lot of work, they realized that the grandmother was the pilgrim's grandfather's sister, who had been left behind, but nobody talked about her. So there was a little digging to do, because a lot of children were left behind in order for them to survive. They were left with Greek or Turkish families, or they were stolen on the way, but they were there. So, and they became, we're cousins now, we're friends. And there has been that opening of the grandmothers, the Armenian grandmothers, all over Turkey. Suddenly everybody had an Armenian grandmother, and that challenges what they consider being Turkish is. And it also challenges what the pilgrims think being Armenian is.
Please.
I want to ask you about something. I'm not sure what the term for it is. I'm going to call it intermediary homeland. Because I'm sure a lot of folks who left that region and immigrated to Canada, the US, Europe, South America, went from there to their final destination. But some, like my mother, spent many years in a third country first. She was actually born 5 years after the genocide and lived on the coast, like a lot of Armenians did. Were protected by the French Navy, so they had some protection, even though it was still a pretty rough time.
So Musada area?
Cease.
Okay.
And one day the French Navy said, "We can't protect you anymore. You have to leave. We'll give you safe passage to England, France, or Cyprus, but you have 24 hours to get your stuff together." So she was just 1 year old at the time. And they thought, well, we'll go to Cyprus because that's close and we can come back, right? That never happened. But for her, she eventually immigrated to the US in New York, but she grew up in Cyprus and Larnaca. And for her, that was kind of what I'm calling an intermediary homeland. Is there any, and so though my daughter has been to Armenia, I haven't, want to go someday, but I'm drawn to go to Cyprus as much as Armenia. Have you experienced any kind of phenomenon like that, people wanting to go to Armenia, but also other kind of intermediary homelands?
I love this question. I haven't, if I comb through, I might find that, but it didn't flag my attention like you are flagging it. But it would be really interesting. Of course, that's true. And people stayed in well, in Beirut for a long time, Aleppo, Marseille, and then came to the United States. They generally came, there was before the genocide, there was a tradition of young men who would leave their villages and either go to Istanbul or go to America or someplace and start a life and make a living and then be able to bring people back. And people who were survivors, many of them had those men somewhere, the women who were sent on the death marches. So their goal was to get to the United States and to reunite. But that's as close as I've gotten to that. So stay tuned now that you can leave an idea. Thank you. Yes.
Yeah. Thank you so much for this lecture. And at a certain point, I just feel I couldn't hold my tears.
Oh.
Yeah. My question is about the memory stories, because I feel that is such an interesting concept. It's not only the memories, but it's a reproduce of the memories, and it's also like inherited. So for me, I feel since memory has already having so many uncertainty, so with memory stories, I bet there must be like some accurate part, some non-accurate part. So one question is like, how do you think it's like, how does this non-accurate part was produced? Second is like being accurate or inaccurate. It's like, does this matter at all? Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. And that's, I mean, that really goes to the heart of memory because we're not looking for the accurate. I'm not a historian trying to say this happened in Yozgat. And I mean, now I know all these stories about the genocide in Yozgat and I can trace all these roots. Somebody else has done it and I could corroborate it or not. But the point is not, as you're suggesting, not whether what they remember is accurate. It's what the feelings are that they carry, because it's those feelings that attach them to the place. And it's those feelings that make the landscape sacred. And it's those feelings that allow them to suddenly perform what I'm calling rituals, but things that they perform that then change what they, the place that they are in. And the type of things that would be accurate or inaccurate may be important from a historian's point of view, but are pretty small. You know, I think so. I think that what you're asking of the accuracy, and I really didn't talk about that a lot, but it's very important that you're right, it's not about the accuracy, it's about the idea of memory. Thank you.
I do have one online. It's from Dr. Ramazan Gunay. First, he said, hi, Carol, feeling someone else's pain and experiencing pain are two completely different things. Therefore, even their relatives cannot fully understand what those experiencing pain feel. I congratulate you for capturing these memories. And then he said, Anatolia is the land of suffering. Many communities and nations have experienced suffering. As a Kurd, I know very well what it is like to be oppressed by the state. You may lose your family, friends, property, and relatives, but your life story always remains alive with you. No one can tear you away from your dreams and your past. Therefore, even if you are forced to leave your hometown, you can be there whenever you dream. Are there similarities between what the Kurds are experiencing today and what was experienced by the Armenians before?
Hello, Ramazan. I met Ramazan right here. He was a visiting scholar in Austin when I was here, and I was really fortunate to have a new story about, you know, what was happening, especially in Diyarbakir, which was very difficult. I don't know if the question is, are they the same or are they dreams? I don't know. The Kurds have been displaced internally in Turkey. So I don't know how, their pain is so visceral and so much death, destruction, and loss of the Kurdish areas moved to different areas in Turkey. I don't know, Ramazan, you can tell me if the kind of looking back, which is not distanced by generations, but is so close, has that kind of sense of it's mine, but I'm still here. The Armenians would say, you know, I'm still singing the dances in Detroit. I'm still having the food festival in Racine. I'm still sending my children to Armenian schools. So I have this kind of life that exists that's an Ottoman Armenian life, whereas the Kurds don't have the luxury of that. Is that somewhat what you're asking, Ramazan? Went back to Diyarbakir. No, we did not. It's dangerous. You're dangerous.
I would add to that, that the difference is that the Kurds don't have a country of their own. Armenians have a country, a republic. It is a fraction of the size of what it used to be historically. But at least there's a country of Armenia. And until the Kurds have a country of their own, and I see that as a very, very difficult situation, considering where they live primarily. I think that that experience diverges at that point. That I think that's a major difference between the Armenian experience and the Kurdish experience. Myself personally, I visited Armenia on 3 occasions. My connection to Armenia predates the genocide. My great-grandfather arrived in Boston during the Hamidian massacres in the late 1800s. But my family was originally from Tabriz, which was a former Persian capital in Iran. And then through Harput and the Ottoman Empire, ended up coming to Boston. But Armenia itself, when I visited, as much as special as it was, it didn't have the impact that I think maybe I thought it would have, because my connection to that part, that this geographical area is not there. My last name has nothing to do with that. My family went from Tabriz straight 400 miles due west to Harput. Literally, you don't draw a straight line 400 miles. It's like going from San Francisco to San Diego, straight line. So Armenia's up here. There's no, that connection isn't as strong. My connection now is through my wife and daughter. Right. So, I'm sorry.
Good. No, these are good points. In terms of the idea of having a homeland, and then whether or not you feel it as your heart's homeland and your soul are important. And I think, I mean, there is a Kurdistan, but not a safe, defined Kurdistan. And if there were one, would people want to leave and go there? No, they want their land.
A lovely note on which to end. I'm sorry, it's
No more.
1:30, but you're welcome to speak with Dr. Bertram.
No, just adding one more point. Should the Kurds thinking the Syrians, you know,
Oh,
Yeah.
you're right.
the Syrians are big,
Another
they don't have just like.
That's
Kurds.
right.
Yeah.
You're right.
Yeah.
Thank you
There's
for
lots
that.
of groups.
And thank you, Dr. Bertram, for a wonderful presentation.
Oh, thank you. Thank you.